Hey nerds! Richard Rorty claims philosophers ask bad questions, which is an interesting critique for a philosopher, I think. So, just to review, pragmatism is a philosophy in which truth is measured based on how practically applicable a claim or theory is in real life. So, an example can be this car works, I try it, it starts and runs, therefore the car works. To pragmatists, that means the car works. And Richard Rorty is who I've talked about many times before, is an atheist pragmatist. And Gianni Vatimo is a contemporary Catholic philosopher. So Rorty and Vatimo wrote a book called The Future of Religion, which I've been doing a series on. And he gets into a really interesting quote here. I've talked before basically about their idea that Nietzsche's Death of God, meaning the decline of religion in culture with the rise of the Enlightenment and increased rationalization and that sort of thing. Um, and that Nietzsche's Death of God opened up the door for religion without metaphysics or a metaphysical God. So basically, your religious beliefs can be anything, and whether they're true or not doesn't really matter. What matters is what is true to you in terms of your religious belief. And part of the reason that Rorty prioritizes that it is that he is a pragmatist. So he prioritizes pragmatic perspectives for questions. Like, for example, I don't think it's definitely not in this book. And I think it's in Richard Rorty's book called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity that he talks about, for example, his answer in the question to does God exist is who cares? Which I definitely agree with because I used to be a militant atheist like Sam Harris, but now I have learned from people like Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson, the moral foundations theory, and specifically cultural evolution through group selection, and this idea through research in that religion helped bond societies together, which is what helps societies progress and help the progress of humanity. Which certainly doesn't mean that there needs to be a religion, but it means that a lot of people have replaced it with ideology and politics and worship of celebrities, which is kind of the thing that Nietzsche was predicting. But anyway, so but Richard Rorty gets into another different point here. And this is an essay by Rorty specifically in the future of religion. So I think this is interesting. Someday, intellectual historians may remark that the 20th century was the one in which the philosophy professors began to stop asking bad questions. So they so all of throughout all of philosophy until the 20th century, to Rorty, philosophers were asking bad questions, and which is an interesting thing to point out because like the 20th, I mean, it depends on how you measure when the Enlightenment was. Like I've talked about Foucault, my favorite post-structuralist 70s pervert philosopher, many times before, and he focuses on specifically the 1600s to the 1800s approximately during the Enlightenment. And Richard Rorty, like basically his pragmatist perspective and so-called postmodernist perspective, which is closer to actually being postmodernist than someone like Foucault or Derrida and their so-called post-structuralism. It's interesting because his pragmatic slash postmodernist view is more and it well so it's basically a reaction to in the Enlightenment. Pragmatism was in a way, and specifically Richard Rorty's pragmatism, because he's an atheist pragmatist, unlike many other famous pragmatists like such as Charles Peirce and William James. For example, Charles Peirce is arguably the founder of pragmatism, and William James is obviously a famous Christian pragmatist. But anyway, Rorty Rorty saying that all of the questions in all of the history of philosophy until the 20th century is interesting because it's also like the height of the you could argue that it's the height of the culmination of the Enlightenment, the 20th century, which is in many ways good and in many ways bad because there are all sorts of atrocities, but there's been massive societal progress and technological development, but then that's led to social media and how much that has pros and cons, of course, but has influenced people's behavior in many bad ways. So anyway, these are the bad questions that Rorty gets into here. So the philosophers began to stop asking bad questions. Questions like, what really exists? What are the scope and limits of human knowledge? And how does language hook up with reality? Which is like, why I like Rorty? Because it's kind of like a contrarian or cynical approach to typical philosophy questions, and I spend innumerable hours talking about other philosophers opinions on what really exists, the scope of limits in human knowledge, and how does language hook up with reality. I was talking the other day about the similarities and differences between language and reality in terms of Noam Chomsky's opinion. And also the other day, I was talking about Foucault's book on the order of things in terms of the connection between language, history, knowledge, and reality, basically. And the scope and limits of human knowledge, epistemology. I've talked about that a lot before recently with like Slavoj Žižek's thoughts on Hegel, for example, and innumerable other philosophers, of course. And so, what exists? Where the scope of limits in human knowledge? How's language hooked up with reality? To Rorty, because he's a strict pragmatist, all of these questions are useless, and philosophers have wasted their time for hundreds or even thousands of years if you go all the way back to the pre-Socratics. But anyway, I kind of like that, even though I love the pedantic philosophizing myself. I totally get his point. So, how does language hook up with reality? He continues. These questions assume that philosophy can be done ahistorically. They presuppose the bad idea that inspection of our present practices can give us an understanding of the structure of all possible human experiences. I like this, and it makes sense. These questions assume that philosophy can be done ahistorically. So I've talked about within the context of Foucault many times before, for example, that what we're learning about from a particular period of history is always historically contextual. Like I talked, for example, the other day about, actually I think it was yesterday, about John Locke, the famous liberal enlightenment philosopher and classical liberal, um, talking about basically the idea that oh wait, no, was it John Locke? Well, it was talking about the idea that, oh wait, no, I was talking I was talking about it, that the fact that the way we understand science, for example, is historically contextual, because John Locke, for example, bases his idea of empiricism, they like to oversimplify the idea that people are born with their mind as a blank slate and we learn everything through our sense perceptions. He was a doctor, so he based that on his opinions about science at the time, but obviously there's been such a high degree of scientific progress and the understanding of human anatomy and that sort of thing that science is outdated and is qualified as pseudoscience today. So his his worldview rests on inaccurate pseudoscience, basically. So, and also Rorty says these questions presuppose the bad idea that inspection of our present practices can give us an understanding of the structure of all possible human practices. So that's very important, very important. So what we can talk about this culturally for sure, like this idea I've mentioned many times before, the stereotypical like American dream or nuclear family or whatever you want to call it, like 20th century idea of heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman, where in which the man works full time and the woman has two kids. This idea That sort of thing is obviously not culturally universal at all. It depends on what part of the world you're in, and it's not historically necessarily relevant at all. Like of this whole idea of monogamy and arranging families in that way is actually very historically recent, and throughout the overwhelming majority of human history, this idea of monogamy with between one man and woman with several kids was not actually the norm. It was like, think about feudalism, for example. There were those sort of things, but they're obviously like kings and princes the had concubines and all that shit, and there were women who had secret sexual relationships. Not that that doesn't happen now, but obviously it was different when there was royalty in feudalism, and you might have had that type of life in feudalism, but it wasn't like as established now. And if you go way farther back in history, like hunter-gatherer cultures, for example, like, it depends on who you talk to, but monogamy was not necessarily a very common thing at all in hunter-gatherer societies. So anyway, the Richard Rorty's point, basically his main point remains totally true, or his main 2 points, I would say, that philosophers ask bad questions because questions like what exists, what are the limits of human knowledge, and what's the link between language and reality, uh, they're the wrong questions to focus on, because history and knowledge are always culturally and historically contextual. So learning about one aspect of, like, the science of biology, for example, or or this idea of universal culture, which it isn't even necessarily a thing according to Foucault, remember. These are why philosophers ask bad questions, because they don't even realize that their knowledge rests in inevitable historical and cultural context. And that's all why, to Richard Rorty, philosophers ask bad questions.